Hi there, guys. So after listening to a lot of you after the last round of debates and just watching plenty of them over the last 2 years, I've noticed there are a few issues that come up that seem to come up a lot repeatedly that could be resolved with a little bit of training. So I've made a few training videos. This is the first one that will outline exactly how to improve your debating in a few ways. Today, we're going to be looking at definitions and what to do when definitions are contested, because I'm sure everyone who's debated long enough has had a debate where the opposition has proposed something absolutely ridiculous, and yet you still somehow lose because you don't quite know how to challenge this absurd definition. So today we're going to have a look at how to do that. So firstly, the affirmative team is supposed to present a definition for the debate in their first speech. I assume most of you guys know that. And the negative teams are allowed to either agree to this definition, which will happen most of the time, or challenge the definition if they don't think it's fair or reasonable. Now, the affirmative team goes first, but they don't have any more right to define the topic than the negative team does. Both teams have a right to define the topic. And the topic that the adjudicator will normally go with is the definition that is more reasonable. So this is more reasonable. You may often hear the definition as like, if you talk to a common person on the street, what would they say the definition is? And yeah, that's the more reasonable definition is like, what is this topic obviously asking? So we'll come to a few examples of this later, but hopefully you guys can normally work out what a more reasonable definition is. That's how you know when someone presents something absurd. And of course, affirmative teams can again challenge and negatives challenge to their own definition. So definition challenges should always be accompanied by as in you're going to need to explain why your definition is more reasonable. You can't just disagree and go, nah, ours is more reasonable. Even if it obviously is, it's just a good idea to explain quickly, briefly, doesn't need to be long, but just explain quickly why your definition is more. Now, let's suppose you have explained why the definition is more reasonable, but the opposition is still continuing with their definition. And at the end of the debate, the adjudicators just got two different definitions to choose from. And it's sort of in their hands what they're going to choose and who they're going to decide with, because depending on which definition they choose, that's who wins. This is why, to prevent that, we do what is called the even if strategy, or the even if rule. So once you have explained why your definition is more reasonable, you should then try to explain why, even if the adjudicator decides to use the opposition's definition for some reason, which you're saying they probably won't, but even if for some reason we use the opposition's definition, explain why you still win. Now, there are a couple of reasons for doing this. One, the adjudicator might actually prefer the other team's definition, and you don't want to put all your eggs in one basket on your definition. But two, it's also a good idea to be complete and ensure that you are arguing fully and completely in favor of your side. And this includes if the opposition's definition is adopted. This doesn't need to be like whole new arguments for the new definition. It could work to just map your current arguments over to the new definition, which I'll have a few examples of in a second. It's also a good idea to try and do this even if and definition challenging at every speaker possible, to keep reminding the adjudicator that you are challenging it and that in all circumstances you win. So like, let's say if you are the affirmative team and first negative brings up something that you think is a bit silly definition wise, challenge it at second affirmative, challenge it again at third affirmative, and keep hammering this home that one, your definition more reasonable, but then even if you went with their definition, you guys would still win. It's important for every speaker to get involved with this. It's not the job of the first speaker or the third speaker. It's everyone's job to try and make sure that your team's definition and your points on the definition are being advanced. Now, there are some definitions that you can't actually challenge because they're just so unreasonable, you can't win with them. So you can't explain why you'd win on that side. So there are a couple of sides of this, like it might be a truism, which is just a true statement that can't really be debated, or the opposition definition must just be so factually wrong that you can't possibly argue. If this is the case, explain why the opposition's definition is so unreasonable that you cannot possibly argue, and point out to the adjudicator that you have recognized, you have made an effort to argue against it, but you weren't able to just because of how silly it was. So try and make the adjudicator really aware that you tried to do the even if thing, because all adjudicators are trained to look for this even if strategy. So make them aware you tried to do it, but if you can't do it, make them aware that like you couldn't do it for the reason I just explained. One possible example is like if the topic was that tomorrow was another day, which is a bit too informal for any topic you'll really see in DAV. But if the affirmative team pointed out that, yes, absolutely, tomorrow is another different day to today, so therefore tomorrow is another day, we're done here, you couldn't really argue you won under that definition if you were the negative team. So you would have no choice but to go, well, this is obviously not what the topic is about. The topic is saying that like tomorrow is another day in the sense of it's a different day. There are new opportunities there that we should look upon it differently. It's not saying tomorrow is literally another day. If it was, there would be no debate here. And such, we can't accept the other team's definition. And unfortunately, we can't argue why we would win under the other team's definition because it's a truism. It's self-proving. Now let's look at a few examples of this in action. So suppose the topic was that we should ban animals in sports, and the negative team defined animals to include humans. Now, this is pretty unfair because no one's really suggesting that we should ban humans in sports. That would just be banning sports. And so the affirmative team should firstly explain that this is a completely unreasonable definition. So firstly, when people say animal, they normally don't mean humans, even though humans are technically in the kingdom Animalia, they normally don't mean humans. And secondly, we'd have a different topic if it was about banning humans. About banning all sports. They wouldn't go to the effort of putting in the word animals. There are other arguments you could use here to explain why it's unreasonable. You should then explain why, even if we adopted the negative definition, you'd still win an affirmative. So this is a bit trickier because it's a tricky definition that's been engineered to give the negative a clear advantage. But one of the things you could say, for example, if you were arguing that we can't make animals compete in sports because animals can't legitimately consent, then we shouldn't force humans who can't consent to. So that argument could map over. Again, it's tricky, but just making the effort to do it will really advance your team in the eyes of the adjudicator. Another example is, and this is one that happened last year and caused a bit of controversy, is that the government should fund universal free childcare. And I was watching a CGS team, and the opposition defined the affirmative team, who was the opposition, defined universal to mean going to everyone earning less than $100,000 a year. This is obviously not what universal means. And the CGS team was a bit confused because they were like, well, this is so obviously wrong. Surely the adjudicator will pick up on this. But they ended up losing the debate because they didn't quite accurately explain why their definition was correct and why they won the debate. So firstly, the negative team should point out this is not a reasonable definition for universal. That shouldn't be that hard. That's obviously not what universal means. Universal means for everyone, and that is clearly not for everyone. But they need to explain, even if we did adopt their definition, why would you still win? Now, this can be a bit tricky because if the negative model, for example, was to run close to the affirmative line, not actually cross it, the negative might have already said, okay, we should give free childcare to everyone earning under a certain amount, but not universal. That might have been what the negative were arguing. And if that was the case, then what they should have done is pointed out the affirmative definition fell on their side of the topic. So pointed out that going to everyone earning less than $100,000 a year is clearly not universal. And as such, it like the affirmative team argument falls on the negatives side of the topic because it is saying the government should not fund universal free childcare. The most important thing to do in these tricky scenarios is to show the adjudicator you've tried as hard as possible to explain what's going on, and it's the really unreasonable definition from the other team causing problems. I'm not saying blame the other team, like point at them, but just explain to the adjudicator that you're trying your hardest to resolve this situation that is only being created because the other team's definition is so absurd. So just like really try and explain, try and use this even if strategy, make the adjudicator aware, and the adjudicator will catch on, they'll be on your side. So final tips to do with definitions. If the other team's arguments are really dependent on their definition, keep reinforcing that the definition's wrong everywhere possible and keep relating your arguments to it and concluding by linking to the definition and the model. Try to make the adjudicator as aware as possible that you've tried to use the even if model, and the adjudicator will normally understand this if the other team's definition is so absurd. Winning a definitional challenge does not instantly win you the debate. There's a big rule in debating that all adjudicators are taught that there are very few things you can actually do to instantly win a debate. So you still need to have good arguments. Don't just assume they put up a ridiculous definition and fall asleep. Still keep arguing as if they've, I'm sure you guys all will anyway. If you want more information, check out sections 6.3 and 6.4 of the Australia-Asia Debating Guide, which is available on the DAE website for more information. Thank you for listening, guys.